The second hero is coming all the way from Kenya. And I'm extremely honored and pleased that she's willing to come. She's a very good friend of mine for years. We worked together when I was Minister for Development and Foreign Affairs. We worked together on some international initiatives, especially in the beginning of the century, to make the World Bank and the IMF and the big institutions more accountable, more poverty-focused, more in terms of the reality of the grounds of Europe and Africa. She was a minister of health, not unimportant, I would say. She was that before COVID, but of course she has a lot of lessons learned there. And she is at the moment a governor. As you know, in Kenya, they have decentralized the system. I think there are more women governors in Kenya than we have commissarissen van de Koning in the Netherlands. You don't know what it is, but they have less power than you, by the way. I'm not saying let's keep it that way, because that's not my goal of my discussion today. But I'm very pleased that you are here. She is in the middle also, frankly, of campaigns in Kenya. Kenya is again this year having presidential elections, which will be absolutely key for the country. She's closely involved in this, but she nevertheless took the opportunity for 2 days to come to Amsterdam. Charity, please. Oh. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Bart Kudas, for that introduction, and also the president of the foundation, Max van der Stoel, the organizing committee, and continuously Mr. Jan, for always inviting me and talking to me, and the distinguished guest meeting here this afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me indeed to be in this meeting this afternoon during this year's Africa Day to share my thoughts on global inequalities and the consequences of climate change and COVID-19. I want to begin by giving a quote from Nelson Mandela, and he said, "As long as poverty, injustice, and gross inequality persist in our world, none of us can truly rest." And that's what I was saying to Bert Kodas, that we have not rested. He said to me, "When are you going to retire from politics?" And I said, as long as these injustices persist, we must be at it until we free African continent and make sure that African continent will get the best that it should get and really truly begin to grow. The above quote by one of the greatest leaders of our time captures the constant struggle we find ourselves in to address the inequalities in our societies. These inequalities are spread across socioeconomic, security, and human rights at local, national, and regional and global levels, and continue to undermine the physical and mental well-being of citizens across the world. These inequalities have the commonality of the creation of mankind in our search and the maintenance of differing societal and cultural norms. It is in this environment that the first global pandemic in 100 years, COVID-19, found fertile ground in which the inequalities between individuals at local levels, and those of states at a global level found fertile ground and further widened the gap of inequality in our societies. The 2013 study by Max Rosa, titled "Global Inequality of Opportunity," found that infant mortality stands at 12.7% in Somalia, in comparison to Iceland, that reports at 0.21% infant mortality rate. The average life expectancy in Sierra Leone is 52 years, while in Japan it stands at 84 years. A child in southern Sudan will spend less than 5 years schooling, while a child in Australia will spend 22.9 years schooling. Income inequality stands at US dollars 661 per capita per year in Central African Republic, while in Qatar, it is US dollars 116,963 per capita per year. As I am sure most of us in this room are aware, that reason for forums such as this one we sit in is the glaring inequalities Africa as a continent has and continues to face. The inequalities in health, wealth, education, and social-political dimensions totally undermine Africa's potential to provide its people with basic services. Some of the causes of global inequalities include unstable political environments, exploitation of poor countries, lack of education, lack of innovation, wars, and natural disasters. These inequalities are evident in agricultural production, trade imbalance, technology uptake, research, science, labor relations, finance, and market access. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is a clear case of how war increases global inequalities. We are already feeling it in Kenya with very high prices of fuel and food prices. According to the March 2022 IMF and World Bank Economic Outlook, the war in Ukraine is already disrupting the world supply chain. Steeper price increases for food and fuel may spur a greater risk of unrest in some regions. From sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America to the Caucasus of Central Africa, while food insecurity is likely to further increase in parts of Africa and the Middle East. The conflict disrupted Ukraine's planting and harvest season, destroyed critical fields, stores, infrastructure, and production, especially in eastern Ukraine. Moreover, the conflict has resulted in shipping being halted from Black Sea, from where about 90% of Ukrainians' grain are exported. With respect to the Middle East and North Africa, it had stated that rising prices may lead to social tensions, especially in countries with weaker social safety nets. Fewer job opportunities, limited physical space, and unpopular governments. This extends to Egypt, which imports about 80% of its wheat from Russia and Ukraine. Africa is made up of countries that are predominantly producers of raw materials and unprocessed foods, while the more developed nations, due to their advanced technologies, access to finance and credit, are engaged in value addition and the materials and act as resellers and consumers of the final product. There are various reasons for this inequality of nations in the value chain. First, we must remember Africa is comprised of 54 nation states as recognized by the United Nations, and a few others that are disputed territories. The majority of these attained their political and economic independence from colonial reigns as early as 60 years ago. Most of these countries are yet to move out of the economic starting blocks to address the economic challenges facing them. Second, due to the relative novelty of democracy in Africa, political instability and instances of long-drawn leadership have stifled the capacity for vibrant and innovative ideas and concepts that would likely have improved Africans' capacity to develop at par with other continents. Tellingly, 60 years ago, at attaining independence, most of these countries were economically at par with the Southeast Asian countries like South Korea, Singapore, Malaysia, and Taiwan. China was still an agrarian economy that could not be considered a third world economy. Today, these Southeast Asia countries were among the top strongest economies in the world. The reason? Visionary, focused, and a committed leadership. The rampant cases of poor leadership have made most African countries remain economically vulnerable and are now dependent on loans as well as grants from these Southeast Asia economic tigers. Because of poor leadership from Africa, decisions, Africa has become captured in a cycle of expensive loans, especially from China. And this is very unfortunate that it is happening to us once again. These loans, mostly for infrastructure projects, come as engineering production contracts, packages with conditions that undermine key economic sectors like manufacturing, technology, transfer, and job creation. These loans are increasing the inequalities in most African countries, since most materials and equipment, services, and top-earning jobs come from China. African countries provide land, semi-skilled labor, basic trade, and expensive loan repayments. There is a direct connection between poor leadership and high inequality gap witnessed in most of the countries. Somalia, Burkina Faso, Uganda, Sierra Leone, and Zimbabwe in the recent past have common thread of very poor leadership that is inversely proportional to the levels of inequality witnessed in Max Rosa's study. Because of the poor leadership, these countries experience uncontrolled misuse of resources, rampant corruption, and other wasteful programs that deny citizens basic services. The results being high levels of poverty, lack of access to basic needs, social tension, leading to conflicts and civil wars in our African continent. These countries and Africa in general spend a huge percentage of its income on security services and the military equipment to stem the consistent internal conflicts. More often, these conflicts are over basic needs such as water, pasture, and distribution of resources. Instead of governments putting more resources to provide these basic needs, they would prefer to buy more arms, more guns, and recruit more officers to deal with insecurity. In other words, they rather deal with the symptoms of the problems that we are having than deal with the causes. Unfortunately, the poor leadership in Africa is encouraged and sometimes propped by the West, with elections in our countries being highly contentious and heavily contested. Election observers, and especially from European Union and the West, more often than not, issue reports of voting that is free and fair and generally representing the will of the people. When pressed, most developed countries will feign an interference, stating, "We cannot dictate how people vote," even when you know the elections have not been free and fair. Then you leave it to us to fight ourselves and to kill each other. The West makes military aid readily available to most brutalized countries with the highest number of vulnerable communities. It is easier to get military aid than to get COVID-19 vaccines, ARVs, or malaria preventing nets. Military and aid rarely comes with good governance and anti-corruption conditions that are always attached to aid. Trade imbalance between the West and Africa is a major cause of global inequality. Trade barriers, restrictions against processed goods from Africa has continued to restrict market penetration for African goods and has contributed to the huge trade imbalances. The impact of trade imbalance has exacerbated poverty and the low incomes in African countries. Most African countries continue to import even the most basic products from the West, like foodstuffs, textiles, and furniture. Kenya imports very good cheese and milk from Netherlands. The impact of importing these goods has stagnated manufacturing in Africa, resulting into high unemployment, low standards of living, and civil strife. Therefore, due to this lack of opportunities, our people continue to migrate to Europe. Climate change and COVID-19 pandemic are two of the most defining challenges of the 21st century. The loss of life and economic meltdown were the most devastating in this 21st century. Climate change and COVID-19 have widened the inequality gap between countries in Africa and between Africa and the West. This has led to more African households shrinking into abject poverty and increased the illegal migration to the West. Thousands of young people and families are risking their lives crossing the Mediterranean Sea to come and seek better lives in the West. According to United Economic Development in Africa Report 2021, 37 million people in Africa fell into poverty as a result of COVID-19. The gender inequalities have also widened the gap. When pandemics such as COVID-19 hit, with women bearing the brunt, apart from being the caregivers in the family, women tend to practice more time trade and mostly perishable goods like fruits, vegetables, and grains. COVID-19 and its resultant closures hit such traders because of the unsold goods that were perishing, that were getting bad. Climate change, on its part, has continued to have adverse effects on the world ecosystem with the disruptions to production, especially in agriculture. Africa is experiencing extreme weather changes arising out of climate change. We are bearing the cost of industrial excesses of the West and China through pollution and the chemical uses. In recent times, Africa has seen extreme weather patterns with devastating impact on livelihoods, agricultural production, and economic activities. Flash floods, long dry spells, drying up of water sources, rising water levels, especially in our internal lakes, fragile infrastructure are some of the effects of climate change. 68% of the African population practice subsistence agriculture, that is rain-fed, uses rudimentary methods of farming and with no government support. The adverse effects of climate change, especially erratic rain patterns, spell doom for these farmers. This has resulted into hunger and famine, forcing many people into abject poverty. Due to the lack of sustainable jobs, most rural communities in Africa practice basic trade that is harmful to environment. This includes charcoal burning, cutting of trees, logging, and river sand harvesting that accelerate deforestation and flash floods. These practices further reduce the farmlands and affect food production. Climate change and COVID-19 have exacerbated the inequalities between Africa and the West. Deliberate and practical and time-bound interventions by both Africa and Western governments are required urgently to bridge the global inequalities and address the consequences of climate change and COVID-19. In 2018, African countries ratified the African Continental Free Trade Area, creating a vast job market of over 1.3 billion people and a potential GDP of 3 trillion US dollars. This is a huge opportunity for inter-Africa trade and industry. The market of 1.3 billion people can create employment for our people, especially the youth. However, African governments need to invest in technology and skills development among the youth to equip them with tools to be productive to serve this market. On its part, the West can participate and support African Continental Free Trade Area through establishment of factories and industries in Africa, as well as technology transfer. And this way the gap in the trade imbalance between Africa and Europe will be reduced. The intellectual property agreement envisaged in the African Continental Free Trade Area will enable Africa to reclaim its abundant brain power that it loses to the West. With this brain power and technology, Africa could begin to close the inequality gap, especially in research and production capacities for essential products like pharmaceuticals and non-pharmaceuticals and medicines. Although climate change, COVID-19 was a global phenomenon, most of the Western countries have bounced back with their transport, hospitality, and their economics sectors up and running. Africa, on the other hand, is yet to bounce back, especially in key economic sectors. This is due to very small skill set and fragile economic system that cannot withstand such devastating effects of COVID-19 and the climate change. COVID-19 pandemic, though devastating in its wake, we also exposed African economic resilience and the capacity to manufacture goods that can be tapped into through inter-Africa trade. During the lockdowns and travel restrictions, most African countries turned to local manufacturing for production of basic goods. It helps us a lot to realize that there's something we can do. This showed that African countries have capacity to manufacture for their own needs. Interventions such as the Global Gateway investment package by the European Union and African Union, developed in February 2022, presents a good platform for Africa and Europe to address some of these causes of global inequalities, especially between the two continents. For Global Gateway investment package and similar interventions to have an impact, it would be advisable for EU funds only to be channeled to those programs that have been identified and prioritized by the beneficiaries. The process should include timelines for delivery, required and expected impact that programs such as those will have on the communities. A lot of times, all these programs are done from the government level that does not sometimes appreciate and understand the needs of the people. This will stem the wastefulness of funds that has been witnessed in the past programs. And lastly, COVID-19 pandemic was a wake-up call for all of us, but more so for the poor countries especially, for lack of preparedness. There is need for each country to design early warning mechanisms and preparedness programs through skills development, technology transfers, and the building of food and health reserves that can help the people when something like this happens. I want to thank you for listening to me. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.